And I really appreciate you joining us this evening for the lecture. My name's Paul Quigley. I teach in the history department at Virginia Tech, and I'm also director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is sponsoring this event. And the center regularly hosts talks like this one. We also sponsor academic conferences. We give scholarships and grants to students and researchers. We do outreach programs in museums and elementary school classrooms and lots of other stuff as well. Basically, we try and get as much good Civil War era history out there as we can to as many different audiences as possible. And you can keep up with everything that's going on at the Civil War Center at our website. It's an easy one to remember, civilwar.vt.edu. And you can also find us easily on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. And I'll tell you just very briefly about our next online event, which is coming up on November 16th. It's a talk about the Civil War in Indian Country with Dr. Faye Yarbrough. And we've got another in-person event also in November. If you're in the Blacksburg area or willing to travel, the center is helping to sponsor a roundtable discussion about Black soldiers in the Civil War and their experiences. And that's going to take place at Historic Smithfield in Blacksburg on November the 6th. And it's part of a whole day's activities honoring Thomas Fraction. He was an enslaved man who escaped from a local plantation towards the end of the Civil War and volunteered in the US colored troops. Okay, on to tonight's event. Our speaker is Dr. Caroline Janney. She works at the University of Virginia. She's the John Now Professor in the History of the American Civil War. She's also director of the John Now Center for Civil War History. And she's the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. She's also a past president of the Society of Civil War Historians. That gives you a sense, I think, of her status and reputation in the field. She's the author or editor of 7 books on the Civil War and its legacies, including the multiple award-winning Remembering the Civil War. And then the book she's going to talk about tonight is very recent, in fact, only 2 or 3 weeks old, I think. And it's called The Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox. And as a college professor myself, I don't condone web surfing when someone's lecturing, but what I'm going to do in a moment is I'll paste into the chat so everyone can see it, a link to the book, because I know many of you will immediately want to get your own copies as soon as possible. So I'll paste that in the chat a little bit later so you can see it. So Dr. Janney is going to speak for about 35 minutes. It will leave us plenty of time for discussion, and we're looking forward to your questions. You can type those into the Q&A box, and you can start doing that at the beginning of the talk if you want, or wait until the end. Anytime, type them into the Q&A box and we will see them there. And we may not be able to get to all of them depending on how many you ask, but we'll get to as many as we can, and we'll wrap things up at the latest by 8:15. So that's all from me. I just want to say how grateful I am that Dr. Janney is able to join us tonight. We'll give her a virtual round of applause and welcome her to our screens. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's my absolute pleasure to join you all this evening, and I appreciate the time to come and talk about my new book. I want to start by saying thank you to all of you who are taking the time to do this. I also need to thank UNC Press for their wonderful support, and all of the colleagues and friends out there who have been instrumental, archivists, people who have helped me do the research for this book. So a big thank you to all of you. And now I am going to share my screen. Paul, give me a thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint. All right, thank you so much. So I will start at Appomattox. We'll start with the end of the war, and that is perhaps the end of the war. In the years since 1865, Appomattox has become a shorthand for the end of the war. We use that phrase and we think we all know what we mean. But what unfolded in that village, what unfolded in McLean's parlor, has come to be seen as the closing act of the war. But the question is, was it really the closing act? The surrender was actually just that. It was the surrender of the largest, not the largest, excuse me, of the most important Confederate army. And it was important, but it wasn't a blueprint for what to do with the tens of thousands of Confederate soldiers who were both in the ranks and not in the ranks. It was not a peace treaty. It was not necessarily a clear ending to the war. Instead, in the days, the weeks, the months that followed, the unanticipated results of what flowed forth from McLean's parlor would become a problem not only for the United States government, but for local communities as well, for Black and white, North and South, Confederate Union, and every other group in between. But let's start in McLean's parlor. Let's start with the surrender and what those surrender terms said. They said that Confederates would turn in their arms and their flags, and they would go home on parole. And that phrase is very important, on parole, as prisoners of war. Grant also promised that they would not be disturbed by US authorities so long as they maintained good behavior. In other words, so long as they didn't break any laws. But as Grant jotted down those terms on April 9th, 1865, he was thinking about how to end the war, how to force Lee's army to surrender. He wasn't thinking about political questions. Again, this was not a peace treaty. He wasn't even thinking about the logistics of disbanding an army. There would be no general order disbanding Lee's army, but there would be a process. The process went like this. After surrendering their arms and flags on April 12th for the infantry, the names of all of those men surrendering would be recorded by company and or regiment, and each man would receive a pass that looked something like this, saying he was free to go home on parole. After receiving their passes, around 28,000 men in Lee's army would make their way home. Many of them walked, some as brigades, as regiments or companies, others with only one or two comrades. Others took up Grant's offer that they could travel free aboard US vessels and railroads, a provision that Grant, as we'll see in just a few moments, came to rescind in the days that followed. So you might be familiar with some of these parole passes. You can see the stamps here on this one, or another for a Texas soldier. And on the back of his parole, as late as July of 65, he was going to the provost marshal's office to get permission to receive transportation from the United States government. Some of these soldiers stopped for rations at US posts. Others refused to beg food from their former enemies. Some, such as those from Virginia, made it home only in a few short days. Others, such as those from Texas or the Deep South states, their journey would take much longer, sometimes even months. But what is really important to point out are some numbers. A substantial portion of Lee's army would not surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And here I'm going to throw some very rough math at you. Of the approximately 60,000 men available to Lee on April 2nd, so this is men that are in the trenches around Petersburg and Richmond, only somewhere between 26,000 and 28,000 were formally paroled at Appomattox between April 9th and April 12th. If we account for the approximately 11,500 casualties that took place during the campaign between April 2nd and April 9th, a conservative estimate would suggest that we're missing about 20,000 men. In other words, 20,000 men from Lee's ranks avoided surrendering at the famed site. Why? Well, their reasons were as varied as the men themselves. Many had been footsore and straggling soldiers, unable to keep up with the relentless pace of Lee's army as it pressed west. Some believed there was little use resisting any further and elected to go home. Some wanted to avoid what they saw as the ultimate humiliation, the humiliation of surrendering to the Yankees. And at least some slipped from the lines on April 9th, refusing to acquiesce or to be conquered. More than 2,000 cavalry, for example, under officers such as Major General Thomas Rosser or Colonel Thomas Munford, headed west toward Lynchburg. Some disbanded and headed home to await word of when they might regroup. Indeed, on April 12th, the very day that Lee's infantry was participating in a formal surrender ceremony at Appomattox, Rosser wrote to Stanton, where he issued a proclamation from what he declared the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia. And I want you to pause just for a second and take this in. Most of the Army is surrendering at Appomattox, but he has declared this Stanton the headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia. He's also given himself a nice promotion. Now he's a lieutenant general. And he called upon his men to shoulder their muskets once more. Quote, and return to the field to meet the arrogant invader who had insulted you, robbed you, murdered your dearest friends and relatives, outraged your fair women, despoiled your homes, and dishonored all that is dear. He would lead his men against this dastardly foe, he promised, and he would never surrender until, quote, the purple current ceases to flow from my heart, or until you are a free, independent, and happy people. Rise like men and come to me, he commanded. Indeed, he instructed companies and regiments to assemble at Charlottesville, Stanton, and Lynchburg without delay. So for men like Rosser, as well as Thomas Munford and Lomax and others, the war was not yet over. Others headed south to North Carolina, where they hoped to join the forces of Joseph E. Johnston. In other words, Appomattox represents a great irony. It was and continues to be seen as the end of Lee's army, and by extension, the end of the war. But a significant portion of the Army of Northern Virginia did not surrender in that small village. So what do we do with those 20,000 men? Why weren't they there? What would happen to them? Perhaps most importantly, would Grant's terms apply to them? Well, this is a question that others had very early. On April 10th, the day after Grant offers these terms to Lee, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wrote to Grant asking if the troops operating in Northern and Eastern Virginia were to be included in the surrender, or only those under Lee's immediate command. Specifically, Stanton is thinking of people like John S. Mosby. Grant says that no, in fact, these terms are really meant for those men that were with Lee, but he believes they should be extended to all fragments of Lee's army. In other words, he wants the war to end. And one of the things that is underscoring all of this, one of the things that I suppose I hadn't taken into enough count before I was researching this book, was the degree to which the fear, maybe not the reality, but the fear of potential guerrilla warfare drove Grant, drove his actions. Yes, he was magnanimous, but he wants the war to end. And he believed that the only way to end the war was to parole as many of Lee's men as possible. So again, one of the really surprising things that I found in doing this research were the number of men who were paroled at sites beyond Appomattox. Indeed, I have ended up creating a database that contains somewhere more than 15,000 men that were associated with the Army in Northern Virginia. Some of them were detached units, so I'm including Mosby, for example, in this. But about 15,000 men who were included in the paroles of Appomattox that were paroled elsewhere. Some of these men did so by their own choice. For example, in the days and weeks right after Appomattox, many of them flowed into places like Lynchburg. And I apologize, it's cut off on this map, but they're just to the west of Appomattox. You see a CHburg, that is Lynchburg. Between April 12th and April 16th, the US Army issued at least 2,800 paroles in Lynchburg. At Burkeville, which is to the east of Appomattox, also circled there in red, Burkeville Junction, which was a key railroad junction of the Richmond and Danville and the South Side Railroad, the Provost Marshal recorded more than 1,600 names in a 3-day stretch between April 14th and April 17th. But this isn't just happening in the environment around Appomattox. In Winchester, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock had ordered circulars posted throughout the lower Shenandoah Valley, which included the exchange of letters between Grant and Lee. I think part of the reason he does this is he wants to offer proof to any doubting Confederates that in fact Lee has surrendered. He has these printed and posted throughout the lower valley. And he also issues a stern statement in all of the local newspapers, urging men to turn themselves in, to seek a parole, to come into Winchester or other sites and be paroled. But at the same time that he offers this gesture of paroling, he also offers a stern message. He says, quote, every military restraint shall be removed that is not absolutely essential. He promised, and your sons, your husbands, your brothers shall remain with you unmolested if they come in and get paroled. But he warns, if they don't, they will be hunted down. And in fact, this is what happens. The Union cavalry will extend out through the valley searching for men. They will go into places such as Mount Jackson and Newmarket, and those of you that might be familiar with the valley, every little hamlet in between. And they're recording the names of men who are coming in. You might notice in this list that a lot of these men are in fact cavalry. These are men who had horses that were able to escape the Union cordon at Appomattox. But what's really interesting about this is that you can see in the parole pass that's issued from here at Winchester, this looks different than the parole pass that was issued at Appomattox, because now included is a description of the person. You can see not only their age, but their height, their complexion, their hair color. This is great information for us to have now so we can imagine what these men might have looked like. But also keep in mind, this is an era before photo identification. So this is proof that these men are who they say that they are. This is proof that they have, in fact, been paroled. So they're flowing into sites within the valley along the northern neck. They're also coming into Richmond in droves. They absolutely stream into Richmond during this period. Eventually about 2,000 will come in seeking paroles. Men such as Spencer Roane Waring, again, another cavalryman from the 9th Virginia Cavalry, and you can see here on his compiled service record that he would be paroled on April 25th, going to the Provost Marshal office there in Richmond. One of the things that I did with my database was to create this spatial analysis that shows me where, in fact, these men were paroled. And this gives you a sense between April 10th and mid-June where these paroles are taking place. You can see that they scatter out across Virginia. They certainly go into West Virginia and down into North Carolina and beyond. So the point here is that regardless of Confederates' reasons for seeking or accepting paroles in the weeks after April 9th, their ability to do so reflected both the inclusiveness and the flexibility of Grant's surrender terms. It wasn't merely being magnanimous that motivated Grant. Instead, it reflected his desire to bring this war to an end, to make sure that every Confederate was accounted for and that everyone was paroled. But Grant had not. He could not have accounted for the host of social, political, and legal questions that followed the surrender and the disbanding of the rebel army. There are so many of these questions, things that I certainly had never considered, but I want to share two of those with you tonight. So the first question that Grant hadn't considered was this: would rebel soldiers, paroled or not, be allowed to pass through loyal Union territory, so through loyal Union states on their way home? Maybe this hadn't been considered because it doesn't seem like it should be a problem. But within a week of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, large numbers of paroled Confederates began streaming into Washington, D.C., to Baltimore, Maryland, and indeed even into New York City. Many of them were requesting free transportation. They wanted to return to their homes in Kentucky and Tennessee and other southern states. And hearing from an exasperated General Lew Wallace about the number of rebels that were coming into Baltimore, especially in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, Grant offered his own seemingly changing interpretation of the paroles. He reads you what Grant has to say to Lew Wallace. It was no part of the agreement that we were to transport or feed paroled prisoners. By the terms of the surrender, they were allowed to return to their homes, and I ordered that their parole should be a pass to go through our lines where it was necessary to do so to reach their homes, and that when they traveled on roads or boats run exclusively by the government, no fare would be collected. I did not calculate that men from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia would expect to go home by way of New York. We furnish no transportation over private roads, and those prisoners who have not homes in Maryland need not be allowed to remain, but may be arrested if they attempt to do so. Now, some of these soldiers, some of these Confederate soldiers, again, even those who had been paroled, found themselves detained for long periods of time. For example, on April 23rd, 10 men from Lee's army that were originally from Tennessee, trying to make their way back to Tennessee, wrote to Lee. They told him that they had been detained at Fort Monroe, there near Hampton, Virginia. They said that they had been on their speediest and most direct route home when they were stopped and detained by Union troops. See, what they wanted to do is they wanted to sail from Fort Monroe up the Chesapeake Bay, go to Baltimore, from Baltimore, catch the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and take the railroad west, where they would travel to Cincinnati, Louisville, and ultimately Nashville. They said this was the quickest way for them to get home. Moreover, they pointed out to Lee that they had no money. They had no clothing, no food. They had no family in the area. They had no one to appeal to for help. So they were turning to Lee, who was back in Richmond at this point. Lee wrote to Grant. He said he had heard of many such cases, and it was his understanding that soldiers from his army were now being compelled to take an oath of allegiance to the United States in order to return to their homes. And he said, I thought the paroles did this. I thought the paroles served the purpose of allowing them to return home. There's a little bit more to this story, but the short version is that on May 1st, Grant would intercede and demand that those men from Tennessee be allowed to return home. But this was happening elsewhere. This was happening throughout the Upper South. It's even happening in places like New York. It's also happening in Virginia. Within Union lines at Alexandria and Fairfax, returning Confederates were required to register with the local provost marshal. Indeed, their names were printed in newspapers as a warning to loyal Unionists that they were returning home, and some were even detained. In Alexandria, for example, several hundred paroled rebels were held in a former slave pen. I think this, the irony of this was not lost on some of these men. They recognized that a war that had been premised on protecting slavery in a building where people had traded in human flesh, they were now being held as prisoners. They knew what the Union Provost Marshal was doing, the message that was being sent. In other words, all of this was a reminder that these men were in fact paroled prisoners of war. We tend to forget that they were in fact prisoners of war. They were not free men. And it was unclear what their status was going to be going forward. Would they be treated as equal citizens in this country once more? Would they have the same rights as those who had not fought for the Confederacy? Would they ever have their rights restored? And would they be prosecuted? Would their paroles protect them from prosecution for treason? All of this remained unclear in those days, weeks, and even months after Appomattox. A second question that Grant and others in the Union High Command had not considered was what was to be done with the approximately 70,000 men from the loyal states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware who had fought for the Confederacy. After all, it was one thing to send Confederates back to states that had seceded from the Union, where the majority of the population had in fact supported secession, that had been in rebellion. There's all sorts of questions that are surrounding this. We've seen that Lincoln was trying to figure out how to lure former Confederates back into the Union in 1863 with his 10% plan. This is all very much up in the air. But what do you do about Confederates that are returning to loyal states, where the majority of the population had remained loyal to the Union? Would former Confederates be allowed to return there to take up their residences once more? Especially in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, this becomes a question. Keep in mind that Booth and many of his co-conspirators were from Maryland. And so people are looking around and wondering who else among us could commit this type of heinous act. So as early as April 12th, so even before Lincoln's assassination, Union officers were worrying about the effects that Confederates returning to these loyal border states, the effect that it was having on the local population. In Maryland in particular, some 20,000 Marylanders had left the state to fight for the Confederacy. And only days after the surrender at Appomattox, one Union officer asked Grant whether all the soldiers that were paroled by Lee, or paroled with Lee rather, might be required to report to the provost marshal's office in Baltimore and register. He wonders whether this is a violation of Grant's terms. Well, the assassination of Lincoln on April 14th and his death the next day by city native and famed actor John Wilkes Booth only heightens the problem in Baltimore in particular. The city was immediately placed under martial law, and all Confederates in the city were to report to the provost marshal, where their papers would be examined. Only those who had former residences within the city of Baltimore would be allowed to stay. All others would be forced to leave, or they would be arrested. And they also were required to get rid of their Confederate uniforms immediately. And in the weeks that followed, this question would continue to come to the forefront. Both Grant and Attorney General Speed would offer opinions and policies that would start to modify, to adapt, to challenge those terms that had been offered at Appomattox. Now, it's imperative to keep in mind during all of this that Joe Johnston's army remains in the field at this time in North Carolina. There are other Confederate forces. Kirby Smith is still in the field. So it is not absolutely clear, despite all the rejoicing that happened following Lee's surrender, it's not clear that this war is over. So on April 19th, Grant informed his subordinates that, quote, all who claim homes in states that never passed ordinance of secession have forfeited their homes and can only return home on compliance of the amnesty proclamation. In other words, they have to take the oath in order to return home. He specifies which states this includes. Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri are such states. They may return to West Virginia on their paroles. We'll come back to that. So on April 22nd, Attorney General Speed will follow up. He responds to an inquiry from Secretary of War Stanton, who's increasingly incensed in part by Sherman's terms that he does offer to Joe Johnston in North Carolina, but also Stanton is starting to question whether Grant's terms were in fact acceptable. And this is what Speed has to say. He says that rebel officers and soldiers who appear in public in their Confederate uniform are violating their parole. They can be arrested and detained. Like Grant, Speed also declared that Confederates had no homes in loyal states. They could not return to Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky without taking the oath. In Baltimore, Major General Lew Wallace wastes no time implementing this order. He issues a circular appealing to anyone, to any loyal citizen in the city, to let him know about any Confederates who've returned. He orders them to be arrested, to be confined. But this isn't just a problem that's playing out among the Union High Command. On April 24th, the Baltimore City Council formally protested the return of any rebels, quote, believing as we do that their presence in our midst will be a constant source of irritation, fraught with the deadliest mischief. In other locales throughout the state of Maryland, such as Frederick, where Jubal Early's forces had threatened to destroy the city in 1864 if they didn't pay ransom, Carroll County and other places, vigilante committees form. All of the counties that you see here in the shaded, in the lined areas are places where vigilante communities or committees formed, places where they are going out and looking for any Confederates who have returned to their midst. It doesn't help that Benjamin Harris, a citizen of Maryland and a Democratic member of Congress, was arrested on April 26th for giving money to two paroled Confederates so that they might disregard their paroles and, quote, make war against the United States again. But remember, Grant and Speed had said that Confederates could return to West Virginia. And this absolutely infuriates people in West Virginia. West Virginia isn't just angry about the fact that these Confederates are going to return to their home, but there is much more at stake. Although West Virginia had been admitted as a state in 1863, there was a great deal of fear that the state would in fact be reintegrated into Virginia. If Confederates returned home and voted, they might potentially outnumber Unionists, and the state might in fact revert back to Virginia. There were as many as 18,000 men from West Virginia that fought for the Confederacy. So Unionists protested the return of Confederates. And again, just as in Maryland, they formed these vigilante committees, at least 12 communities that I've found in the state of West Virginia formed these committees. These committees do much more than issue resolutions. They are acting on them as well. When Confederate veteran Samuel Woods reached his home in Barber County with one of his sons, a group of armed civilians and Union veterans stopped him and ordered him to turn his wagon around. He actually pulled out his parole pass. He insists he has a right to be there. They let him go at that moment, but throughout the summer of 1865, he will endure threats to his life and that of his family. But things weren't quite so simple in Marion County. In Marion County, when reports of 2 returned rebels reached the home guard, they visited the men's mother, who insisted that the 2 brothers had not returned. But the 2 were found hiding in the woods. One was killed and the other was wounded by gunfire. In other words, the violence was continuing. But this brings me to one more point about violence and the ends of war. Ending the war would mean a host of new realities for the entire nation, but perhaps for none more so than for African Americans, especially the 4 million who had been enslaved at the war's onset. In 1861, nearly 1 out of every 20 to 30 Confederate soldiers had brought a slave with him to manage gear, to cook meals, to mend and wash clothing, to tend horses. Now, the number and percentage of body servants had decreased over the course of the war, but the Confederate government had responded by impressing more and more enslaved men, as well as free Black men, to labor for the armies. So hundreds of Black men, both enslaved and free, remained with Lee's army at Appomattox. Indeed, some of them were listed on the parole lists, but we also know about them because of Confederates who wrote home about them. For example, John Crawford Anderson of the 13th South Carolina informed his father that his valet and cook Peter, quote, still proves true and says he will never desert the cause, but is very much elated at the idea of getting home. So he says that Peter is still loyal, in other words. This is foreshadowing the lost cause tributes to the so-called faithful slave that would gain popularity in the late 19th century. And we have no record of Peter's emotion as he waited in the camps with Lee's men, but it's likely that his private sentiments accorded with other African Americans who christened April 9th, 1865 as Freedom Day. One of those soldiers, a man by the name of William H. Harrison, we have no picture of Harrison, but we do have pictures of other United States colored troops, recognized that he might have been camping alongside Lee's army rather than with the Union Army. Harrison had been born in Richmond, and he had been forced to accompany his owner to war with Lee's army as a body servant. He was captured in 1863 and then forced to fight for the United States colored troops. Yet from the Union ranks at Appomattox, he could proudly claim his part in destroying slavery. Quote, I was with General Grant when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. That was freedom. But the Black men who had been forced to labor for the Confederate military effort faced many of the same challenges as their former masters in making their way back home to their loved ones. One of their first dilemmas would be, how would they get home? How would they travel? Would they leave Appomattox on their own, or would they go with their former masters? Some of them decided to go on their own, but for many, it seemed safest and the best choice to accompany paroled Confederates. Keep in mind that the fear, the terror that had undergirded slavery had not ended at Appomattox, had not gone away. These men had reason to be afraid. For Confederates, the presence of United States colored troops served as a stark reminder of both slavery's demise and the rise of a new social order for white Southerners. There are countless examples in diaries and letters of paroled Confederates complaining about having to check in with provost marshals where there are United States colored troops, of having to board vessels alongside USCT soldiers. Complaints were one thing, but others claim to have responded with deadly force. Near City Point, Virginia, where so many Confederates went to board steamers to sail both north and south, while waiting to board a steamer sailing south, a group of Florida soldiers claimed to have killed a Black soldier. And from Richmond, a Black newspaper correspondent reported that, quote, rebel officers continue to strut about in uniform in which they delighted to murder Union soldiers, in a spirit which is almost beyond the degree of loyal forbearance. There were likewise several cases of white Southerners tried by military commissions in the spring of 1865 for assaulting and murdering Black soldiers. The presence of Black men in uniforms, perhaps more so than the surrender itself, represented the death of the Confederacy and the rise of something new, but it wasn't quite clear what that new would yet be. There is much, much more to this story. And I could go on, but I'd like to leave you with this. Rather than serving as a clear ending to the war, the surrender of Lee's army brought into stark relief many of the legal, the social, the political questions that had plagued the war from the very beginning. Perhaps most important, there had never been a golden moment when Lee's soldiers had been so thoroughly subjugated that they were willing to accept any conditions. If anything, the humiliation of registering at Provost Marshal's office, the perils of border region Confederates, the bans on Confederate uniforms, the struggles to return home, the presence of both white and Black Union troops occupying their homes, emboldened the claims of former Confederates, emboldened their claims of Southern righteousness and Northern barbarity. You see, the disbanding of the Army of Northern Virginia had not marked the end of the nation's division. It was only the beginning, foreshadowing much of what would play out in the decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can almost hear the applause, even though many of you are hundreds and thousands of miles away. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We've already got a few questions in the Q&A box, and I want to encourage everyone to keep those questions coming. And to start off with, I'll ask a question. You did touch on this in the talk, and this is one of the kind of downsides of inviting questions before you finished. So you did touch on this a bit, but I wonder if you've got more to say about the difference in treatment of Confederate parolees before and after Lincoln's assassination. So what kind of a difference did the assassination make?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I think I expected different things than I saw. On one hand, the assassination, it's very site specific. So in places like Baltimore, in places where you are in loyal states, where you have a significant portion of loyal citizens and the military, there is a very clear and immediate crackdown. And it's a ban on Confederate uniforms. There is a ban on even the color gray, of wearing things that look like a gray uniform. There was a private school, a boys' school in Baltimore, and the school was told that they couldn't wear Confederate gray anymore. And that happens very immediately after Lincoln's assassination. Bans on pictures of Booth being sold, again, very quickly. But the surprising thing was that I thought I might find the paroles ending quickly. In fact, it's the opposite. There is a surge in effort. There is a real commitment among people like Hancock and others to make sure that every Confederate is accounted for. And so the paroles actually, there's an uptick. And I think there's an uptick among Confederates seeking them because they realize, oh, that parole is going to protect me. So there's kind of a carrot and a stick effect going on there. So the assassination both encourages Grant and others to make sure that the paroles are being extended, but it's also a lure, if you will, for Confederates to seek them.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. Question, you mentioned uniforms, which I was really interested in as well. This idea that, uniforms immediately became a badge of, rebeldom, and nobody was allowed to wear them anymore. One person is asking, what if they had no other clothes to wear than their Confederate uniforms, which I'm sure was the case for many of these guys.
Right. So the most important part was to get rid of any insignia, any signs of rank. So any officer was to get rid of any buttons or anything that would denote rank, and those were cut off for them. Union soldiers, there are accounts of Stanton in particular, of Union soldiers that are standing there clipping off any insignia. And there's other accounts of that. Some of the Texas soldiers, as they're passing through Mobile, Alabama, and elsewhere, are talking about the humiliation of having their buttons cut off. So the buttons that would have said Texas on them, that would have denoted what state they were from, or any other signs of rank. The uniform thing is really interesting because in some places, again, there's so much of this is up to the local commander. And in Richmond, General Ord is in command there, and he acknowledges that many of these men have no other clothing. And so he says, as long as you're not wearing any rank, I'm going to look the other way. It takes him a long time. It's midsummer before he comes around to saying, okay, no more Confederate uniforms. But in places like Norfolk, where there's, again, a strong Union presence, that happens really quickly. There is the famous, or perhaps I should say well-known incident of Henry Kidd Douglas, who is a Confederate from Maryland, goes back to Shepherdstown, and he knows he's not supposed to be wearing his uniform, but a young woman in town convinces him to get his picture taken with her. They go into the studio, and he will later claim that he couldn't change because there were women present and he couldn't change his clothing. And so he wears his Confederate uniform out into the streets. He's actually hauled in, and there's a military commission because he's violated his parole. And the ultimate penalty for violating parole is death, is execution. He doesn't get that. He actually gets sent to prison for several months for wearing his Confederate uniform. He's the only one that I've been able to find that was actually charged as such. But this is a really important big issue that people are paying attention to.
Yeah, and one of the things I really enjoyed about your book was the way it captures the sense of anxiety and fear on both sides. It's a moment where nobody knows what's going to happen next. Is the war really over? Is there going to be a new outbreak of violence? And I can imagine uniforms play into that and kind of reflect those fears.
Absolutely.
And there are a couple of questions actually on that issue of when wars end, particularly, of course, the Civil War. So one person asks, when would you say the Civil War really ended? Another person has an even more general question: does war ever really end?
So I'll take the second question first. And I'll offer that I thought a lot about the work of Mary Dudziak, who is a legal scholar at Emory. And she has a book called Wartime. And she looks at 20th century wars. And if we think about the language that we use to talk about the war on drugs or the war on terror, these are wars that seemingly have no end point. There's no clear ending in mind, and that we're in a constant state of war. What she's looking at are civil rights and whether civil liberties are suspended during wartime. And if we have this very capacious understanding of wartime, then can't civil liberties be violated at any point? So I was thinking a lot about that definition and how different wars come to an end. When I was still at Purdue, I taught a graduate level class that was titled Ends of War, which is how I ended up with the title of the book, that looked at how different American wars have ended. I started with 1763 with the 7 Years' War, and thinking about how different wars end. There's no peace treaty, as I've said several times tonight, for the American Civil War, unlike 1763 or the American Revolution. And so in that sense, it's a civil war, and civil wars do often end differently, although the American Revolution could be said to be a civil war, I think was a civil war as well. But to the first question, there's a difference, and I know that I am walking a fine line here, but there's a difference between the legal state of war, and the legal state of war is over in 1866. But there's also the perception of war, and the notion that these big field armies are not going to fight anymore. I think that's really said and done. People are believing it's done after Appomattox, but it's really said and done after April 26, when Johnston surrenders. But then there's all these other murky questions about what's going to follow. And so it's much easier for us to look back now and pinpoint those dates. What I was trying to capture was some of what you were talking about just a few moments ago, Paul, is that uncertainty and that trying to suspend what we know and imagine what it was like to go day to day and not know what was coming next. And so I think if we would have asked people that summer, they might have been a little uncertain as to whether or not the war was truly over or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think on the other hand, one of the things you show is that Lee's surrender was so symbolic because of, the way people viewed Lee. And we've got a question about Northerners' views of Lee. Did they see him, as the be all end all? And did they as soon as they read in the paper that he had surrendered, did Northern civilians breathe a sigh of relief and say, this is basically it?
I think overwhelmingly, to that latter question, yes, that when people hear of Lee's surrender, there are bonfires and illuminations and gatherings from not just Washington and Boston, but in San Francisco. This is happening. There is a real elation that these 4 long years of war are finally coming to an end, because they do see Lee as the symbol of the Confederacy, that his army is the heart and soul of the Confederacy at this point. So that is the case until the assassination. And then people are looking around thinking, oh, is this what's next? Is this going to be a different type of war? Is this what we can expect? And Sherman says as much in letters to his wife and others. He's saying, this is what we can expect. This is what we can expect from cowards and slaveholders. This is the type of war they're going to turn to now. So that there is that unsettling, that fear, and as you said, anxiety that is palpable.
Yeah. We have one attendee who's wondering about the kind of technicalities of what Confederate soldiers were allowed to take home with them, rifles, horses, this kind of thing. What were the rules there?
So Lee's men could not take home their rifles. They had to leave their rifles. They were also supposed to leave their regimental flags. And a great many of them did, but there certainly are a lot of accounts of men who either chopped them up, tore them up, and everybody took a piece, or there are accounts of people wrapping them around their bodies and taking them home. Those are really badges of honor for them to take the flags home. But beyond that, they could take whatever personal belongings they had. Lee had spoken to Grant about taking home their horses. Keep in mind that Confederates, unlike Union soldiers, cavalry, artillery, providing their own horses. And so Grant does allow them to take home their own horses. And he does allow the use for officers. Officers are allowed Union wagons, ambulances and whatnot to take some of their belongings with them that will then be returned to the United States Army. But that is a way of getting, so when you see wagons rolling away from Appomattox, that has been allowed by Grant under the terms that would be returned. But so yes, their horses, yes. And officers could keep their sidearms.
Right. And we have a related question as well about the journeys home and the idea that they would be transported home on the Union dime. What were the rules regarding that? And you talked a bit about, people kind of raised their eyebrows at this idea that they would be able to travel home through free states, but what were the rules there?
Right. So Grant issues special orders number 73 on the morning of April 10th. So following his surrender conference with Lee. And in that, he says that they should be able to use government transports. So government transports, not private transports, but steamers that the United States government is using to move its own troops, for example, that they can take those to reach their homes. Keep in mind, it's going to be much faster for a man from Georgia or Louisiana to go to City Point, board a steamer, and sail home than to walk or take railroads overland. So at first he says, we're going to allow that, but then it's very quickly taken advantage of. Rations are another thing. Rations are to be provided, but there are only so many rations to go around. So there's lots of stories of Confederates that are, kind of the last to leave Appomattox, and they come into a place like Burkeville Junction, and there are no more rations to be had, and so they're not getting them. But this is something that Grant is using as a way to quickly get these 28,000 men away from Appomattox. But it kind of spirals out of control. And so on one hand, Grant is talking out of both sides of his mouth, because he does say that they can use government transports, but then he gets so fed up with it when people are going north to go south, which again, for many was the logical route to take, but Grant hadn't thought about it that way. And so he says, no more, this isn't going to happen anymore. So he does change his position on that. Keep in mind, though, the railroads are such an issue. Men can take a railroad for a short period of time, and then the tracks have been busted up, and then they can't take them anymore. There's so many logistical problems of trying to get home. But I would say the vast majority of Confederates that are heading to beyond Virginia, they're going south, they're going to Danville, and then ultimately to Greensboro, North Carolina, trying to catch what railroads are working to head south.
Yeah, like you say, I mean, it's hard to imagine what you would do if you found yourself in Appomattox in 1865 and had to get home to Georgia or something like that. What a journey. So one attendee is asking about the troops who sort of refused to surrender and wanted to continue the fight, or go and meet up with other Confederate armies still in the field. How important were those troops in kind of inspiring further resistance to the Union armies?
So I don't know that they were all that important in the grand scheme of things in terms of continuing the fight. What they show us, I mean, there are a significant number, certainly there's thousands of cavalrymen who are out there. There are fewer artillerists, but there are these groups of artillerists in particular that are making their way to places like Lincolnton, North Carolina, which is in the western part of the state, with plans to go join up with Johnston. So there are those that legitimately want to join the army that is still in the field. They say, we were not surrendered, we weren't included in the terms, therefore we can continue the fight. And so they're looking to join a regular army. I think the numbers that are truly interested in some type of guerrilla warfare are actually rather small. But the point is that there's enough fervent belief here. There's enough hope still that Confederate independence can be had, that it shows us that the surrender doesn't just quash that. It doesn't make Confederates believe all of a sudden, oh, well, our cause was wrong and we're going to wash our hands of it and willingly comply with whatever the United States government now says. So I don't know that they were significant in stirring up any further resistance and actually having any impact, other than Union Army resources are being sent to make sure that they're not doing those things. So there are cavalry that are being sent out all over the place looking for these men. So that's the the real impact that they have. But it's more about so many of these men in the 1880s, 1890s, certainly by the 1890s, and publications such as the Confederate Veteran are saying, I never surrendered. I am a proud, defiant rebel who never surrendered and never will. And so that feeds the lost cause.
Right. Mosby is kind of an important character in the book, and you talked some about him tonight. One person is asking what happened to Mosby in the end.
What happened to Mosby? So Mosby disbands his Rangers on April 22nd. It's what was then called Salem, Virginia. So outside of on Interstate 66 between Washington and Front Royal. And he refuses, he meets several times with Union leaders, and they're trying to get him to surrender his whole command. He refuses to do that. Instead, he disbands them. He rides south, trying to reach Richmond, trying to perhaps meet up with Lee and others, figuring out what he's going to do. The short version of the story is he is a thorn in the side of Union officials for the rest of April, May. He will finally be paroled on June 17th. But then people don't believe he's actually paroled. He's been such a menace to Union authorities that when he shows up in Alexandria later on that year, he will be detained, and he will continue to be a thorn in the side. And then if we really fast forward, which is not in this book, perhaps a teaser for books to come, for all that he did refusing to surrender, he will become one of Grant's biggest champions. And he will become a Republican and persona non grata among many Confederate veterans. So he's an interesting fella.
Yeah. And you can't blame those Union soldiers for being a little bit suspicious when they saw him.
No, the gray ghost.
Yeah. Somebody is asking about disenfranchisement and the right to vote, and what were expectations around that in 1865 as the war was coming to a close. How did that factor into people's ideas at that point?
Right. So here we'd have to talk about pardon and amnesty, and Johnson's proclamation on May 29th, which grants amnesty to everyone below the rank of colonel, simply by taking the oath. Anyone above the rank of colonel or above, and many other stipulations, such as they had served the U.S. Army, gone to West Point, been in Congress, they all have to apply individually for a pardon. So once that process, and there's so much to that process, but once they have either received amnesty or pardon, then they get their voting rights back. That will happen in the states, in Virginia and elsewhere, in the summer of 65. But until those states are readmitted to the Union, they don't get to vote in federal elections. So there's no congressional, Senate, presidential election. So Virginia, for example, the first presidential election that Virginians will vote in is not until 1872, but they will have state voting rights by the summer of 65.
Yeah, and that's of course a really important kind of longer term part of the story of reintegrating ex-Confederates into US politics. So by the way, we have several attendees who are giving their thanks in the comments. So, I'm mostly focused on the questions, but people clearly enjoyed the presentation. Some of them are kind of sharing their own stories. One person lives in Appomattox. Many of their family were in the 18th Virginia Infantry. They left home, fought, and ended up back at home in Appomattox, which is kind of a nice circle, I guess. We have a question actually from one of our students at Virginia Tech who's asking about the sources and specifically the parole lists made at Appomattox. Mm-hmm. Is there one place or a few places where you had to go to consult those parole lists? And are there any other great sources that you used for this project?
So the paroles are all at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They're all part of Record Group 109. And they are organized by place of parole. So lots and lots of boxes, many states, and I'm sure there are Army of Northern Virginia guys that are in with the Texas paroles and in with South Carolina and Florida, I knew that the bulk of them would be in the states that I looked at. So I did look at North Carolina extensively, Virginia and Maryland and West Virginia, but they are the one image that I showed of those lists. That's what I went through. So I spent weeks and weeks and weeks just going through that portion of records at the National Archives. And then I had the assistance of a graduate student who helped me transcribe and put these into a database. And so lots of work went into those, but from the National Archives was the place I did the most research for this particular project.
Right. And it actually sounds kind of appealing now after we've not been able to do research for the most part for a year and a half.
Absolutely.
Even if it was a little tedious to go through so much. Let's see, what about reactions from local people when these Confederate soldiers came along on their way home? You know, did local people tend to help them with clothing, food, shelter?
Depended on where they were and who they encountered. So one of the things that soldiers did, many of them continued their diaries after Appomattox, and they those that did continue wrote down the names of people who helped them and people who didn't. They were clear to point out, you know, so and so refused to help us as in their listing. But in many communities, people helped out to the extent that they could. There's some places that I guess the impressment agents must have missed, because there are feasts that some of these soldiers talk about participating in, and there are multiple accounts of these. I should add that one of the other surprising things with the number of soldiers who marched away, not in groups of 2 or 3, but entire regiments, and in a handful of examples, brigades are marching away. There's a group of 1,000 men that march away from Appomattox together toward your area, toward Southwest Virginia and over into Tennessee. But there are places that they know to be careful when they enter certain parts of North Carolina where they know there's a strong Unionist sympathy. They're all very careful. There are maps that are drawn and passed around to other Confederates about these people will be helpful and these won't be helpful. They're also forcing African Americans to help them as well, both free and enslaved along the way. So they are also looking for quartermaster depots. They know places where there should be stores that the Confederate government has of dried peas and sorghum and all of these other things. And they are looking for those places and for mills as well. So there's a lot of word of mouth. There are people helping them. And then there are some people who absolutely refuse.
Right. There's a question about Joe Johnston's soldiers and whether they faced similar fates and the extent to which they kind of intermingled with Lee's former soldiers on these journeys home.
Right. So one of the reasons that the terms are significantly different at first that Sherman offers to Johnston. But one of the things that does hold is that some of these men will be allowed to keep their weapons, to keep their rifles on their way home. And that is intended to allow them to hunt for game along the way. There's only a handful that are allowed to do so, but that's a lesson learned, if you will, from the disbanding of Lee's army. But they absolutely are intermingling. There are also lots of accounts in North Carolina of Lee's men coming into North Carolina saying that Lee has surrendered, and Johnston's men refuse to believe them at first. And then when it becomes apparent that this is happening in places like Greensboro, they're all heading for the stores. They're all heading for the warehouses and trying to get as many provisions as they can. So there's a bit of chaos that ensues, but I really didn't follow the story of Johnston's army, but they absolutely overlap and inform each other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when were the final Confederate surrenders? One viewer would like to know.
The very final surrenders. So we have Stan Wadey in June of 65, and Kirby Smith is early June, June 2nd of 65?
Yeah, I think so.
And then there's the CSS Shenandoah, but I'm not sure that it counts, but that's not a significant issue if we're talking about Confederate soldiers.
Well, I like to talk about that one because that's only about 30 miles away from where I grew up.
I'm sorry, no offense meant.
But that's the Confederate ship that finally surrendered in Liverpool in England on November 6th. So yeah, kind of like you say, maybe not the most significant surrender, but has a claim to being the final one, I guess. How about Jefferson Davis's role and attitudes in all this? Did he see Lee surrender and know the game was up, or did he still hold out hope?
Oh, he tries to hold out hope. And as his mobile White House, as I like to think of it, he boards the train from Richmond, flees Richmond, and he's headed to Danville. So he has all of these temporary capitals of the Confederacy, first in Danville, and ultimately he makes his way to Charlotte. And he is certainly, by the point he's in Danville, he's refusing to believe, and he's still urging that there be a fight. And Beauregard and others have to come to him and say, look, this isn't going to happen. Breckinridge, who's now Secretary of War, says that this is over. If Lee has surrendered, this is over. And Davis is still holding out hope. And I mean, how realistic? Obviously, he's not realistic at all, and he will be captured on May 10th. But he has that same attitude as some of Lee's men. There's men who refuse to surrender, who refuse to capitulate, to see the so-called funeral of Lee's army, and are trying to find any last way out. He absolutely embodies that attitude as well.
A couple of questions about the black camp servants or body servants, who were forced to go with the Confederate officers. And, you talked a little bit about them having a very different kind of experience once the army surrendered. So one viewer is asking whether having been part of the Confederate war effort, albeit coerced, did that kind of complicate the process of homecoming for them? Obviously, 1865 is already a chaotic situation for everybody, including African Americans in the South. Did that experience of having been alongside Lee's soldiers affect the way they kind of came home and reintegrated?
So that is a story that I tried to find. I tried to look for some of these individual men and see if there were any accounts in WPA slave narratives, in diaries, even diaries of the white families that they were heading home with, any accounts of what these family reunions looked like. And I completely came up empty-handed. I hope that it's out there somewhere, and one day we can piece that part of the story together. That the small bit that I do have, Porter Alexander's groom, it was someone so Porter Alexander's artillerist in Lee's army, and he had hired a slave from another man. So he didn't own him, but he had rented, if you will, an enslaved man. And when when Charlie is his name, when Charlie is aboard a train that is going, is eventually heading to City Point, but he's on a train with other Black soldiers, Union soldiers, and he talks about how they treat him horribly because he has been associated with Confederates, which is an interesting sort of dynamic there. But beyond that account, that's the one piece that I really could never put my hands on. It's a great question.
This one may be hard because it's always difficult to quantify when you've got such a large number of people with different experiences and attitudes. But if you had to come right down and generalize the Confederate soldiers surrendering, would you say there are more of them who are in denial about losing the war? Or are there more of them who are glad it's over and are ready to go home?
So quantifying that is absolutely difficult. I think some men had both attitudes, that they were tired and weary and hungry and wanted to go home, but that didn't mean that they wanted to concede defeat. That, I mean, many of them, that's why they kept justifying it. That's why they justified, and that's why they believed what Lee was telling them in his farewell, when he said, you know, this is through no fault of your own, that we have been overwhelmed by superior Northern material and resources. So you haven't lost so much as you've been overwhelmed. And in no way does losing this war mean that what they were fighting for was somehow not right, that it was not righteous. They never make that argument, even when they're tired. I mean, they're, you know, I have some examples of men like Benjamin Sims, who's a Virginian who had been conscripted. So he doesn't join up in the spring of 61 like so many others. He's conscripted into the Confederate Army. And at Five Forks, when he gets his chance, he goes home. He's like, I'm done. But that doesn't mean that he didn't believe in Confederate independence. That doesn't, and he's saying all the right things. So I think the big circle that I've made in my writing and thinking about all of this is that the lost cause really is born in this moment. I was wrong in my first book. It wasn't the ladies who created it. They helped really get it going, but it's born in the spring of 1865 amid the way that the war comes to an end. So yeah, I think a lot of them are absolutely tired, but so are the Union soldiers. Yeah. Diary after diary of men in the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James are saying, the war's done, we are exhausted, we want to go home. And so they believe that the Union has been put back together. There's nothing about ensuring that slavery is in fact dead. They've done what they came to do. So they're all tired of war. So those two things don't necessarily exclude one another.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer. Maybe one final quick question in the time remaining.
Sure.
Is the database you mentioned available publicly?
Not yet. And that is something that I'm working on. It needs some fine tuning, to say the least, some cleaning up, but that's something I'm working on.
Great. So is the plan then to release it as a website someday?
I think so. So no promises, but that is my hope.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure that would be of great interest to future researchers, you know, as well as just readers of your book. So we will look out for that development in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's absolutely our pleasure. What a wonderful talk and conversation. And I want to thank all the attendees for coming along. I know that this isn't quite as satisfying as getting together in the same room and getting to meet the speaker and that kind of thing. But I'm really, really glad you made time this evening to join us for this talk. And I also want to thank donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies who support everything we do and make it possible. So thank you. We hope to see all of you at future Virginia Center for Civil War Studies events. And again, the next one is with Dr. Faye Yarbrough on November 16th. That's the next online lecture. And you can go right now, if you want to civilwar.vt.edu, and you can register for that upcoming event in November and see a little bit more of what we've got in store as well. So most of all, I want to thank Dr. Janney for taking the time and sharing her expertise. Just a brilliant talk, excellent book. I recommend everyone click on the link in the chat and get your own copy immediately. Now your appetite has been whetted by tonight's wonderful talk. So thank you very much and good night.